What's up, everybody? Welcome to Apocalypse here, Christianity you can live with. On today's primer video, we're going to be doing the second part of our primer on rereading Romans 1 to 3. Today, we're going to have a little bit of fun as we're going to get into the Socratic rereading of Romans 1 through 3. As we talked about last time, there's a group of opponents running around at the time Paul is writing Galatians, Philippians, and Romans. And in Romans, Paul is setting up a teacher's argument in Romans 1:18 to 32. And then now today we're going to talk about how in 2:1 through 3, Paul is going to be using a Socratic argument against this teacher or opponent and showing how his opponent's position has all of these problems and contradictions that end up essentially making his gospel kind of bogus. At the end of the day, especially for converting pagans to a law-observant Christianity. So as I talked about at the end of last video, one thing we need to appreciate is that the teacher's opening in Romans 1:18 to 32 has left himself out of the orbit of indictment in that text. It's all about the other that's being sinful, even though they know God. They suppress the knowledge of God and then sort of snowball of vices that result from that ultimately, that are essentially idolatrous at the end of the day. But the teacher doesn't apply this to himself. So there's Socrates. So Paul's going to have his sort of Socratic moment going forward in this text. So because of the teacher's failure to include himself in the indictment of the teacher's opening progression, we can kind of imagine Paul being like, what if I take the argument that the teacher has just presented in 1:18 to 32, widen its scope, and apply it to everyone, including the teacher himself? What sort of conclusions might follow from doing that? So that's kind of what Paul's up to. I'm sure that many of us have thought the same thing when we're trying to converse with somebody, perhaps on social media, especially with people who constantly judge others for their shortcomings, but then refuse to apply the same standards to themselves. That's kind of what's going on here. We might reply to a particularly egregious Facebook post or a tweet or something. Hey, if you think that other people should be held to X standard, why don't you include yourself in that? This pushes the person's own commitments back onto them. It's a Socratic maneuver. It's basically called universalizing. It's taking something that's applied to a specific group and expanding the scope and applying it to everybody, especially the person who's proposing this very limited account of indictment. So Paul does this brilliantly in Romans 2:1 to 8. And it results in some really, really embarrassing problems for the teacher's gospel. If you've lost track of your Bible at this point, you should probably find it and open to Romans 2, even though I'm going to have it up on the screen. It's probably going to be helpful for you to have it in front of you as well. So Romans 2:1 to 6, Paul comes in. Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same thing. You say, we know that God's judgment on those who do such things is in accordance with truth. Do you imagine, whoever you are, that when you judge those who do such things, and yet do them yourself, you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you despise the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience? Do you not realize that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But by your hard and impenitent heart, you're storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. So the you here, the you in question, is someone who's judging other people for sinful behavior that brings about God's judgment. This you also, according to Paul, does the very same thing himself and is therefore just as condemned as everyone else. Now think for a moment. Who does this sound like? Who does this you sound like? The you, the judger here, referenced in 2:1, is a dead ringer for the figure uttering and endorsing the words in 1:18 to 32. That text is a judgment that condemns others who are without excuse because of their catalog of sin and intentional rejection of God's nature and expectations, right? The teacher's judgmental sermon, in which he doesn't even pause to implicate himself in wrongdoing, but only condemns others, fits precisely the description of the judger in 2:1 through 8. That judger is the teacher that's been speaking in Romans 1:18-32. So how does Paul proceed with this Socratic argument then? And how does he use what is said in the opening verses of the teacher's sermon to turn on the teacher? Romans 1:18-32 makes clear that the teacher believes that God will judge the pagans for their sinful behavior. They know God but reject him, willfully turning to various unnatural activities. God responds to their sinfulness by executing retributive justice in the form of the death penalty. They deserve to die. It follows that the teacher believes that damnation, and hence salvation, are based strictly on what one does. It's a desert-based account of salvation. Disobedience leads to death, and implicitly obedience leads to life and salvation. But this obviously needs to be applied fairly. So according to the teacher's thinking, consistent doers of wrong deeds will be judged wicked and condemned to death, while consistent doers of good must be judged righteous, and so enter into eternal bliss with God. Why? Because they deserve it. It's desert-based. So we see in 2:6-8, Paul shows that the idea that salvation and damnation are based on deeds underlies the teacher's claims in Romans 1:18-32. So we have Paul saying, "For God will repay," according to what you've just said, "according to one's deeds, to those who by patiently doing good seek for glory and honor and immortality, and he will give them eternal life. While for those who are self-seeking and who obey not the truth but wickedness," as you've just said, "there will be wrath and fury." Paul is basically saying to the teacher, according to everything you've just said in your opening, in your judgmental opening, you must affirm that every person is saved by their good deeds in accordance with God's will, or damned in accordance with their bad deeds, right? In other words, Paul is demonstrating that once the teacher's position in 1:18-32 is applied to everybody, so it's universalized, its basic theology is revealed to be a salvation based on desert, or good deeds, and a damnation based on desert, or bad deeds. Paul, however, does not just do this to uncover fundamental presuppositions in the teacher's sermon. Paul also wants to show that the teacher's own claims turn out to be rather embarrassing for his attempted missionary project of this Jesus plus Torah gospel for the Gentiles. Paul now begins a kind of reduction of the teacher's preaching. And he does this in two parts, which appear in 2:9-16, and then the second part being in 2:17-29. The first argues out of the principle of deeds-based or desert salvation and damnation, just mentioned, and applies it first to Jews and then to pagans or Gentiles, revealing that Gentiles must already possess some kind of inherent law, naturally, in the light of which they can be judged. So this is 2:9-12. There will be anguish and distress for everyone who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. For God shows no partiality. All who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all those who sinned under the law will be judged by the law. So the first kind of clearly humiliating result of the teacher's gospel concerns disobedient Jewish people. Specifically, not Jews universally. Paul shows here that the teacher's own preaching implies that Jews who are observing the Torah must be judged, and if it proves necessary, they'll be condemned for wrongdoing, which takes place in relation to the written Torah that they have. So even the teacher's converts to his Jesus plus Torah gospel aren't going to escape judgment if they happen to disobey God's dictates in the law. Paul carefully removes here any distinction in the teacher's thinking between Jews and pagans. And the teacher would be forced at this point to accept Paul's reasoning. So Paul continues in 2:13-16, "For it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified, according to the teacher's gospel. When Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them on the day when, according to my gospel," not your gospel, "according to my gospel, this God through Jesus Christ will judge the secret thoughts of all." So remember back in Romans 1:18-32, that the teacher said that Gentiles are without excuse. They know what is good, but intentionally do the wrong things. So Paul suggests here that according to the teacher's argument, there must be the presence of sufficient information about God and what God expects of the pagans without the possession of the Jewish Torah. According to the teacher's opening, pagans already do possess a law innately, giving them accurate information concerning God's expectations. This law judges them fairly, just like the Jewish Torah judges Jews fairly. You can probably detect already why this is going to be a problem for the teacher, since his gospel is all about the need for Gentiles to adopt the written Jewish Torah in order to truly be saved, right? Jesus and Torah. Now, in verses 14 to 15, Paul carries through the notion of doing. Righteous actions lead to future declaration of righteous. Pagans doing righteous things demonstrates their innate possession of Torah. This point is now becoming a really awkward implication of the teacher's opening anti-Gentile tirade. Having an innate Torah, pagans can actually do the necessary good things on their own without appeal to the written Jewish Torah and still be declared righteous by God. They still get justified. We should note quickly that while Paul is concerned with engaging Socratically with the teacher through Romans 2 to 3, he'll occasionally insert small anticipations of his own position, which lies ahead predominantly in Romans 5 to 8. He finds it difficult to refrain from including at certain points what he himself actually thinks. So for example, in verse 16, according to my gospel, right, God through Jesus Christ will judge the secret thoughts of all. And as we talked about a bit in the last video, one of the shocking features of the teacher's gospel, articulated in 1:18 to 32, is that it doesn't talk about Jesus. Christ plays no clear role within its construction, and he has no function for the teacher in relation to knowledge of God or judgment. In fact, he can't have a significant role at this point. His centrality has been closed out from the very beginning. The basis of an approach to righteousness and damnation based on deeds necessarily overrides any contribution coming from an unconditional, liberative act of Christ, which occupies the very heart of Paul's own thinking. The teacher can't abandon his key position concerning judgment of people, or his whole argument would fall apart. This would be like removing the foundation of a house and expecting it to remain standing. It would crumble to the ground. So Paul simply cannot resist noting in verse 16 that Christ's absence from the teacher's thinking is a massive shortcoming, and that his own gospel is far more powerful in this regard. So Paul's going to deepen the embarrassment that's already been happening to the teacher at this point in Romans 2:17 to 29. Paul is still responding to the teacher, and this is going to result in even more upsetting implications for his opponent. So let's read 2:17 to 14. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast of your relation to God and know what his will and determine what is best because you are instructed by the law, and if you're sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of truth and knowledge, you then, that teach others, will you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You forbid adultery, do you commit adultery? You abhor idols, do you rob temples? You that boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So Paul brings up the charges of the teacher's hypocrisy in 2:21a, claiming that the teacher has committed certain offenses ranging from stealing to robbing temples. While these particular transgressions do seem a bit extreme for an everyday person, and these probably refer to a specific historical event for which Douglas Campbell has argued in Deliverance of God. I'll put a reference to that in the description. Paul's point is that the most outlandish sins can still happen, even when one possesses the Torah. The teacher is convinced that the written law supplies a certain moral advantage for its adherents, as well as a certain advantage in terms of salvation. The pagans who lack the Jewish Torah, also, in the teacher's mind, lack the embodiment of knowledge and truth that it reveals. They're sinful to the core and need the saving presence of the Torah in their lives. The Torah's instructions will apparently solve the Gentiles' basic problem for the teacher, creating in them righteous activity that will secure for them the declaration of righteous from God. But take a look back at 1:18 to 32 in your Bible for a moment. There, the Gentiles reject accurate thinking about God in 1:19 to 22, which results in futile discernment and the darkening of their minds. God sees this and proceeds to give up on them and give them up to distorted desires in 24 to 26, through which they engage in supposedly immoral and unnatural sexual behavior. From there, a list of sins follow. The teacher believes that Torah observance will help reverse precisely this bad situation while illuminating the mind of God, who through the Torah helps one maintain control over one's lusts. Now, let's go back to our present verse, Romans 2:25, where Paul shifts from the Torah in general to circumcision in particular. So 2:25 to 27, circumcision is indeed of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if those who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of the law, will not their uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you that have the written code and circumcision but break the law. In the situation outlined in the preceding verses of chapter 2, when someone claims the importance of Torah observance but doesn't actually follow it faithfully, they will not, according to Paul, have any advantage at final judgment. Even their circumcision will become undone. The fact that Jewish Torah observers still sin proves that circumcision does not actually work in the way that the teacher supposes it does. That is, as a way of sort of removing or snipping off sinful passions. But beyond sinful law observers, Paul also mentions, again, the potential for the existence of righteous pagans. Back in 2:14 to 15, Paul argued that the teacher's position necessarily resulted in the possibility of righteous Gentiles getting saved by their good deeds, because they possess a law within themselves that reveals God's character and expectations. If this were not so, then God's punishment to their sinful behavior would be unjust. Culpability requires at least some degree of knowledge of the standard by which someone is being judged. So it follows that Gentiles could perform the good deeds of the Torah written on their hearts with no explicit need to adopt the Jewish Torah and so be saved. But Paul takes this another step further. It's now possible for these righteous Gentiles who keep the Torah written on their hearts to condemn unfaithful Jewish people on Judgment Day. As he makes clear in verse 27, those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you that have the written code and circumcision but break the law. Pagans simply do not need to observe the Mosaic Torah in order to be saved. Moreover, righteous pagans might even humiliate people who insist full Torah observance yet fail to follow its instructions obediently themselves. Paul is not done, as another embarrassment concerning what it means to be a true Jew becomes clear. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others but from God. So Paul's effectively saying to the teacher, according to what you've been saying about people deserving damnation or salvation depending on their deeds, surely the righteous are the ones who are truly Jewish, right? You're basically admitting now that righteous Gentiles are the true Jews. Why would you want to say that? As a result, the teacher has foolishly defined Jewish identity in terms of anybody who has access to God's expectations and obeys them. He's accidentally undermined the importance and specialness of Jewish Torah observance in general, and circumcision in particular for Gentiles. The very people he's been trying to persuade to follow the Torah in the first place. The teacher's argument has therefore backfired, and the integrity of his gospel, as well as his whole missionary program to the Gentiles, is starting to crumble. But at this point in Romans 1 to 3, Paul has mostly been deconstructing the teacher's argument concerning how people attain salvation. Now Paul sets up a more direct dialogue with the teacher. This will be Paul's final move against the teacher. So 3:1 to 20, Paul traps the teacher. Got that ugly looking bear trap there. Some New Testament translations show this dialogue on the pages clearly, and some others don't. But we're going to lay out the exchange here. So you have person 1 and person 2 going through there. Most interpreters read person 2 in the conversation as Paul himself. In person 1 as Paul's sort of speaking in the voice of a general, usually Jewish objector. Now, if Paul himself endorses the positions advanced in Romans 1 to 2, and there simply is no teacher in view, as I've been talking about, then Paul would have to be the one defending the theology of strict deeds-based salvation and condemnation. That is precisely what person 2 is doing in 3:1 through 9a. On this view, Paul has already apparently been committed to the posture of Romans 1:18, endorses the implications of 1:18 to 32 in 2:6, and then targets some generic Jewish figure throughout chapter 3. Accordingly, person 1 would be the unnamed Jewish questioner who is curious about any remaining Jewish advantage in Paul's thinking. Paul, as person 2, would be insisting that the combination of deeds-based righteousness and God's wrathful response to sinners must be true without exception. But if we think back about what we've discovered about Paul's gospel in previous videos, in the gospel series, we can sense a real problem here. Paul is fundamentally committed to God's unconditional love, who mercifully delivers God's people from sin and death, regardless of the merits of those saved. If Paul is person 2, then he's actually overriding his most basic theological commitments. But what if we switch them? If we read Paul as person 1 and the teacher who appeared in the preceding chapters as person 2, then a coherent picture comes into focus. The teacher is the one who is committed to defending merit-based salvation as person 2, which has been evident since 1:18 to 32 and 2:6. He is the one being interrogated in these verses, not Paul. Paul is now situated in the role of the interrogator. So here's what the conversation would look like with the interlocutors correctly identified, I think. So now you can see we've got Paul being the questioner and the teacher being the one who's responding, all the way through to 9a. So why does this matter? Why does it matter if Paul's positioned in this way as against being the one answering the questions? Since 2:1, Paul has universalized the teacher's premises concerning the problem facing Gentiles, applying them to the teacher's solution of Torah observance. This has removed any advantage that the Torah and circumcision give Jewish Christians and converted pagans. We need to emphasize again that Paul's not targeting Jewish people per se. He's zeroing in on the teacher and his theological and missionary program. Paul asked the teacher a question that was directly implicit back into 17 to 20, in which becomes more explicit in verse 25 in relation to circumcision. Do Jews, according to the teacher's gospel, have any advantage at all? Paul has, of course, been using the logic of the teacher's own gospel to demonstrate that circumcision and Torah observance do not guarantee any participants advantages over others. It would simply be unfair if they did. One would assume that by this point the teacher would have understood Paul's argument and so responded to the question of 3:1 by saying something like, "None, we don't have any advantage. There is no advantage for Jews in terms of ethics and salvation. Thanks for helping me out, Paul. I understand now." One of Paul's goals in this section is to do just that, to get the teacher to kind of admit what he's doing, to move the teacher to admit that circumcision and the Torah do not guarantee an ethical or saving advantage, because, implied by the teacher's own thinking, if a Jewish person sins, they will endure the crushing justice of God, just like everyone else. So Paul depicts the teacher as responding as if he has not been paying attention at all, asserting quite boldly that Torah-observant Jews still enjoy advantage in many respects, as you see in verse 2. The purpose of the next 7 verses is to show how Paul elicits the correct response from the teacher concerning Jewish advantage. Notice, in verse 2, the teacher says much in every way. In verse 9a, the teacher admits no, not at all. So how does he get him there? How does Paul get the teacher to admit that there is no advantage? Paul's going to kind of reorient the conversation toward God, asking the teacher whether God's standards of judgment are going to be relaxed when Torah-observant Jews sin. Paul asks, what if some were unfaithful? Will not their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? So if said faithless person were to receive an advantage and so evade God's judgment, then God's justice and divine character would have to be abandoned altogether. God would not be just if the severity of God's justice were selectively enforced. Faced with this slightly different approach from Paul, the teacher responds with an emphatic "by no means" or "hell no." Paul then asks the teacher whether sinful deeds will invalidate God's justice in accordance with this character. The answer is, of course, no. God's judgment will not waver in relation to the sinful deeds. In fact, those who suggest it does are themselves condemned. So here we have the teacher. Let God be true and every person false. And Paul, is it not unjust for God to pour out his wrath on me? And the teacher responds, indeed, how would God judge the world if that's the case? Paul responds, but if by means of my falsehood the truthfulness of God overflows to God's glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And the teacher says the judgment of those saying this is deserved. So the result of the conversation in this final back and forth between the two interlocutors, Paul and the teacher, is that the teacher now gives a contradictory answer to the one he gave in response to Paul's initial question in verse 1. Paul has actually forced the teacher to admit that there is no Jewish advantage. So now the teacher admits, no, not at all. And we can compare that to what he says in 3:2a, which is much in every way. So Paul's succeeded in getting the teacher to admit this. The teacher is now forced to admit that no advantage in terms of salvation actually exists, whether presently or on the day of judgment, for anyone in a sinful position. There is no good, valid ground to suggest that God modifies God's character as the good judge. So having heard this admission finally from the mouth of the teacher, Paul makes his concluding move, and he writes, "For we have already charged all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. As it is written, there is no one who is righteous, not even one. There is no one who has understanding. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. There is no one who shows kindness. There is not even one. Their throats are open graves. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of vipers is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths. In the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world be held accountable to God. For no human being will be declared righteous in the sight of God by deeds prescribed by the Torah. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. So it's 3:9b through 20. Paul's further contentions are introduced here in 3:9 with the claim that all people, Jews and pagans, are under sin. The claim of universal sinfulness eliminates any remaining optimism that the teacher and those persuaded by him may have. While the teacher has been endorsing a program of salvation that is biased toward those who obey the written Torah, Paul accuses him and any person who shares the teacher's position of comprehensive and deep-rooted sinfulness, such that every mouth is silenced and the whole world is held accountable to God. Now take a look back in your Bible at Romans 1:19 to 20 and compare that with 3:11. There, back in 1:19 to 20, the teacher suggests that knowledge of God is accessible to everyone and understood and seen through the things that God has made. Paul suggests here, contrary to the teacher here in 3:11, that in fact no one has understanding and no one seeks God. That is, no one will be saved by following the teacher's gospel of deeds-based salvation. While this text is commonly read as a simple kind of universal indictment, building on the preceding material, it seems clear in the light of our reading that this is actually a barbed engagement with the premises at the very basis of the teacher's own system. So now, having admitted that there is no advantage, and having endured Paul's critique concerning depravity, the teacher is now finally silenced. Using the teacher's own logic, Paul has shown that the teacher's program fails miserably, since Gentiles do not actually need to follow the Jewish Torah in order to be saved. In fact, if God is truly just and humanity, including Jews, deeply sinful, then the teacher's gospel of Jesus plus Torah observance simply will not save anybody. His program is not just flawed, it's fundamentally false. It is, to reiterate what Paul says in Galatians, no gospel at all. Okay, so now we're going to do a performance of the reading. I've got Laura here to help me out. She'll be Paul for the performance of this reading, and I hope it'll help you kind of digest what's been going on through this pretty long video. So Laura, as Paul, take it away.
All right. I'm confident in the gospel because it's the power of God for anyone who has faith, to the Jews first and then the Gentiles. God's deliverance is shown through faith for faith. As our Bible says, the righteous one, and we know this is Jesus, through faith will live.
For God's wrath is being shown against sinful and wicked Gentiles who reject what is true. The truth about God and his expectations are clear to them. They can actually see it all around them in creation, so they don't have any excuse for not honoring God. They intentionally refuse to thank him. It turns out they've become stupid and have started worshiping things in creation. Because of this, God, who is blessed forever, amen, has rightfully abandoned them to those things that they desire more than God in their hearts, to humiliating their bodies, to those disgusting passions, like women having sex with women and men with men. These people are not right in the head. They're filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They gossip, they slander, they hate God. They're arrogant, boastful, come up with all kinds of evil. They rebel against their parents. They're stupid. They lack faith. And they don't have hearts. They know God's truth about them, that they deserve to die for all the things that they've done. But they not only do these things, but they support others who do them too.
Oh, but given what you've just said, teacher, this also means that you don't have an excuse when you judge others. When you judge others like you've just done, you condemn yourself. Why? Because you are doing the very same things. You say, we know that God's judgment on all those who do bad deeds is in accordance with the truth. Don't you think that when you judge those who do such sinful things, yet do them yourself, that you will be judged by God? Do you, as you've implied, hate God's overflowing kindness, restraint, and patience? God's kindness is meant to turn you back to God. It seems like because of your hard and impenitent heart, you're actually storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath, when, as you've said, God's righteous judgment will be revealed. According to your own thinking, teacher, God will repay each person according to what they've done. To those who do good, he will give eternal life. For those who do wicked things, there will be wrath. In other words, there will be punishment for everyone who does bad things, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good things, regardless of whether one is a Jew or a Gentile. God doesn't play favorites, right? Now, let's think about this a bit more, teacher. You'd agree that people who do bad things without the Jewish Torah will also perish apart from Jewish Torah, so Gentiles, and all who have sinned under the Jewish Torah will be judged by the Jewish Torah, so Jews. As you've implied, it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of God's expectations who will be called righteous. But it follows directly from what you've said that when Gentiles, the very people you were just judging for doing bad things, instinctively do what Jewish Torah requires without possessing it, this is its own Torah. Like you said in your opening, God's expectations are clear to them already. That must mean that they have a Torah on their hearts and can access it in their own conscience. This is either going to accuse or excuse them on the day of judgment, when God will judge the secret thoughts of all. Although according to my gospel, such judgment will specifically happen through Jesus Christ. But teacher, you call yourself a Jew, and you rely on the Torah and boast in your so-called special relation to God, and you claim to know his will and can determine what is best because you are instructed in said Torah. If you are sure that you are a guide for the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of people you've called stupid, a teacher of children, and you're sure that the Torah embodies knowledge and truth, then why don't you apply those same standards to yourself? When you preach against things like adultery, stealing, idolatry, and temple robbing, do you do those things yourself? You sure talk a big game about the importance of obeying Torah, but what happens when you break it? Don't you dishonor God? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now, let's talk about circumcision, which you seem to be so adamant about its importance for Gentiles in order to control their passions. It's of value if you obey Torah, right? But if you break Torah, your circumcision might as well be uncircumcision. According to your thinking, if those Gentiles who are uncircumcised keep the requirements of Torah, which are written on their hearts, won't they be regarded by you as truly circumcised? Won't those very Gentiles then condemn you that you have the written code of circumcision but break the Torah? Why do they even need the Torah then? It seems that, according to you, they'd be the true Jews, with real circumcision being a spiritual matter of the heart, and being Jewish in general is an inward and not an outward matter. Such a person would be praised not by others but by God. So what do you think now? Do Jews still have any kind of an advantage, O teacher? Is there still any value in circumcision?
In so many ways, yeah. For starters, we were entrusted with the very words of God.
Okay, but what if some of them were unfaithful? Would their faithlessness cancel out God's faithfulness?
Hell no. Even if every person were a liar, let God be proved true, as it says in our Bible, so that you may be declared righteous in your words, and so make it through judgment unscathed.
Sure, but if our human injustice highlights God's justice, can we say that God is unjust for punishing us? I'm speaking in a human way, of course.
Hell no. Then how would God judge the world?
But if through my untruthfulness, God's truthfulness overflows his glory, why is God turning around and punishing me? And why not just say, as some people we both know have slandered us by saying, that we should do evil things so that good may result?
Their judgment is totally deserved.
Right, but what should we say now? Are we Jews really advantaged in any way?
Well, no. I guess not really.
Correct. And here we can charge all publicly, Jews and Gentiles alike, of being under sin's power. As our Bible says, no one is righteous, not a single one. No one understands or seeks God. All have turned away and become worthless. No one shows kindness, not one. Their throats are open graves and their tongues deceive. The venom of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of hostile speech and bitterness. They are quick to kill with ruin and misery in their paths. They don't know the way of peace, and they do not fear God. Now, we know that whatever the Torah may say, it speaks specifically to those under it, so that every mouth may shut up and the entire world may be held accountable to God. For no one, O teacher, will be declared righteous in God's sight through good deeds, not even good deeds prescribed by the Torah, and not even if it's added to believe in Jesus as a condition for salvation. For through that Torah came the knowledge of sin. And it looks like at this point, your entire gospel is bunk.
Thank you, Paul, for helping me out. So to conclude, I'm going to respond to kind of common objections that come up to the Socratic rereading. Some critics of the reading are unhappy that more sources contemporary with Paul aren't cited, supporting the phenomenon in the ancient world of what we would call block quotation. So some reviewers of Douglas Campbell's work have gone so far as to say that it's therefore implausible. But this isn't an especially powerful rebuttal. The principal reason cited for the rejection of the Socratic reading of Romans 1-3 is along the lines of something like, the Roman reader of Paul's letter would not have known that he was speaking Socratically in Romans 1:18 to 3:20. Therefore, your construal needs to be rejected. They just wouldn't have understood it. There's not enough evidence, so I can sort of dismiss this. But there are actually a number of serious problems with this line of objection. First, it overlooks the positive evidence supplied for the contingency or circumstantial nature of this reading, which is primarily argumentative, as we have just seen in specific relation to Judaism. Although it's important to appreciate that I'm not suggesting, and Douglas Campbell's not suggesting, analyzing Romans 1:18 to 32 in isolation and making snap judgments about speech and character in relation to this text alone. The role is only apparent when all of 1:18 to 3:20 is in view. With this extended purview, there are good reasons for construing Romans 1-3 in Socratic terms. As a whole, it's a better argument and more responsible in theoretical terms in relation to the rest of Paul's thinking about important topics like the gospel. These broader advantages then, I think, make the assignment of a dramatized role in 1:18 to 32, the first paragraph of the argument, likely. And this positive evidence adduced by Douglas Campbell in Deliverance of God can't just be ignored. Put slightly differently, the objection that the Romans just wouldn't have understood it leaves all this positive, essentially argumentative evidence from his proposal intact. If the original Roman readers could distinguish a good argument from a bad one, then they did hear the text in a Socratic fashion. So 2, there actually is sufficient data in the sources explicitly attesting to the presence of Socratic argumentation, along with its intrinsic dramatized subsections in the ancient world to confirm its possibility for Paul and his audience. There's even a letter genre that affirms it, the ironic. Pseudo-Libanius describes a type of letter, quote, in which at the beginning we praise someone by means of acting, but in the end reveal our goal, that what was spoken was acted. This is an apt description in general terms of what I'm suggesting is taking place in the opening chapters of Romans, namely an opening argument in a letter that subsequent developments reveal is not in the letter writer's own voice. And scholars are finding even more support for this. One of my good buddies at Duke, who's a PhD student in New Testament, has found some really fascinating stuff in relation to Philo that I think is going to really drive this home. 3, children in Paul's day were taught to recognize and use this technique of argumentation. It's described in ancient school teaching manuals, usually as quote-unquote character making. Children were taught how to read and to compose fictitious speeches in character, and sometimes even in letter form, in the ancient equivalent of modern high school education. So far from being a rarefied rhetorical technique, it was all over the place in Paul's day. The next is every extant treatise trains their students in argumentation and so devotes considerable attention to refutation, going on to speak explicitly in relation to refutation through Socratic dimensions of internal contradiction. Theon, who's the earliest recorded teacher, says, contradiction is discourse that attacks the credibility of another discourse. Try to show that the speaker spoke as much against as for himself. What some call turning his argument against himself. End quote. One of the techniques used for rebuttal then was the demonstration of inconsistency in the opposing position. Students were also trained to undermine opposing positions because of unclearness, incredibility, and impossibility, inappropriateness, inexpediency, and other circumstantial factors. So the Socratic argumentative strategy that I'm suggesting is operative in Romans 1-3 is explicitly identified in what we would loosely call a high school textbook in Paul's day, in particular relation to the students' training in refutation. So we can turn now to the question of explicit evidence in Paul, and we need to recall that all scholars accept that Paul does quote from an interlocutor at times in the early argumentative stages of Romans. Many scholars accept further that Paul uses another distinctive voice in what we would call paragraphs as well, especially through much of Romans 7:7-25, a text that's actually a lot longer than 1:18-32. And the use of this strategy here has even been recognized since ancient times by someone like Origen. Some have objected that the relevant ancient sources generally mark the beginnings of such speeches overtly, a cue absent from the vicinity of Romans 1:18. But this ancillary objection kind of collapses because there are plenty of ancient examples of unmarked speech and character, and more will be coming to light, as I said, once Andrew finishes his dissertation from Duke. But suffice it to say, there's quite a lot of evidence in Paul himself and in Romans that attests directly to the presence of this dialogical strategy. We also need to remember that texts function very differently in the ancient world from our modern one, within a fundamentally different culture of production and reception. So we need to resist the tendency for anachronism, or intruding into our interpretation things from our modern context. Readers of Paul are operating in an emphatically cross-cultural situation when we're reading these texts, and so we need to realize that. This next one's really important. The main objection to the Socratic rereading overlooks the role of performative cues in relation to any ancient text's public presentation. Cues that were in play for a letter's reception by way of the letter bearer. Scholars have really begun to realize relatively recently that communication in any contingent or live context depends to a surprisingly large degree on performed verbal and bodily nonverbal cues. Given that the letter bearers of Romans, Phoebe and her entourage, would have heard the performance of the letter in Paul's presence at Corinth first and been instructed by him in various ways, it would seem absurd to suggest that a Socratic opening could not have been understood by the original audience. The opening would have been performed in this way, both verbally and non-verbally, and repeatedly. And then, if necessary, it could have just been explained to them. And it should be added that ancient Roman readers were probably rather more sensitive to the performative cues than modern, sort of post-European interpreters. So that's the rereading. And then we did a bit of a performance of it. And then I responded to some common objections. So this has been the second part of our Rereading Romans 1-3 primer mini-series. So thank you so much for listening to these. I hope you learned something. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. We really, really appreciate you who are watching and engaging. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here, Christianity you can live with.